Welcome to the Alsandor Law Podcast, your go-to resource for demystifying family law with experience and empathy by your side. Hosted by attorney Cheryl Alsandor, founder and lead attorney at the Alsandor Law Firm and a board-certified family law specialist. Together with attorney Cheryl, delve into the intricate world of divorce, child custody, and more, sharing valuable insights, expert interviews, and real-life stories to support you on your family's legal journey. No matter what challenges come your way, our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Join us and let us help you find clarity amidst the legal maze, paving the way for a brighter future.
Welcome back to the Alsandor Law Firm podcast, where we demystify the legal challenges surrounding family law in Texas. I'm Cheryl Alsandor, Houston, Texas board certified family law attorney, and I'm here with my podcast buddy, Brandy Spaich. And today we're discussing the complexities of dividing property in a Texas divorce. We're going to uncover what counts as community property, what remains separate, and why these distinctions matter more than you think. So stay tuned as we break it all down.
All right. So let's start, I think, first with why is it so important to understand property classifications in Texas?
So Texas is one of the few states that follow community property laws, which can significantly impact the outcome of your divorce. So if you misclassify property as separate property, but it's actually community property or what we call marital property, you may be giving up something that the court really has no right to take away. The court only has the right to divide your marital estate, also known as community property. So if you misclassify something, you either are going to be losing out on something you're entitled to, or, again, giving away something that the court could otherwise not take away from you. So you definitely want to classify your community property as community property and your separate property as separate property.
So, you went into it a little bit, but exactly why should couples make sure they're prioritizing an accurate property classification?
Well, couples want to make sure that they are prioritizing their property classification because not all property is treated equally. Separate property is going to include things like assets that you owned before marriage, gifts, any gifts that you receive at any time during life, before marriage, during marriage, or after marriage. Those gifts are going to be separate property. And inheritances are going to also be separate property as well. So if you inherited a family home during the marriage and kept it in your name, it's likely going to be separate property. And you don't want to misclassify, for instance, a separate property home as community property, because then the court might take it from you or give your soon-to-be ex-spouse a share of it, and they're not entitled to it. Okay, this distinction, it's really important only because, again, community property is the only property that the court can really rightfully divide in a divorce case. So if you misclassify it, it could lead to an unfair outcome in your divorce case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any examples of where some incorrect classification had some pretty bad consequences in a divorce case?
You normally don't hear about it in a divorce case, because if I'm representing the client, I'm going to
Right.
try to avoid that. So I haven't really had a personal experience with that. But what I do is I try to warn clients in advance of how misclassification can help them. And that conversation usually comes up when I am encouraging a client to provide the documents we need to prove the proper classification. And we're saying classification, but the proper terminology is character. It's the character of the property. So, does the property have community property characteristics or character, or does it have separate property character? So we'll say, what is the character of the property, community or separate? And the way that we prove that is by having proper documentation. So what I find myself doing is warning clients that, hey, if you don't give us the proper documentation, and typically it's documentation to prove separate property, hey, if you don't give us that proper documentation to prove that that house is your separate property or to prove that bank account money was inherited,
Mhm.
then the court's going to construe it as community property or marital property, and the court's going to divide it. And that is definitely not something anyone wants if they have property that shouldn't be divided.
Right. And so, like, exactly how does Texas distinguish between community and separate property?
So the state of Texas helps us out, and it makes an assumption or presumption. Texas law presumes, or I tell my clients assumes, that everything that you have is community property. And then the burden is on the party that wants to prove that it's separate property, or whether the party that says, hey, that's not community property, that is separate property. Well, the law says, okay, well, you have to prove it. You have to prove that. So to answer your question, tell me your question again.
Just generally, like, how does Texas distinguish between community and separate property?
Right. So it's really by the evidence, I
Mhm.
guess, to answer your question. Again, the assumption is that all of it's community property. And then one of the parties pipes up and they're pleading that, hey, I have separate property. And then at court, usually at trial or even before trial and mediation, they're saying, hey, no, that's my separate property. And then we have to say, okay, well, where's your proof? And there's certain type of proof that's needed for separate property.
Mhm.
The standard is clear and convincing evidence. Okay, so what is clear and convincing evidence? Clear and convincing evidence is usually going to be documents, to prove that, for instance, real property is separate property. We're going to be looking for a deed, and we're going to be looking at the date of the deed. Okay, was this property purchased prior to marriage? Or maybe it was inherited, maybe it was bequeathed in a will. Then we want to see the probate document. So there's usually a document trail to prove one separate property.
I gotcha. That definitely makes sense. So it's kind of a community property until proven otherwise situation.
That's a good way of saying it. Yep, I agree with you.
All right. So how would a court determine exactly like what constitutes equitable distribution?
Ooh, okay, that's a great question. So, when property is divided in Texas, it's not exactly 50-50. And some people think it is. And I think that's where a lot of courts try to start. But that's not what the law says. The law says there should be a fair and equitable division of property. And so, yes, it has to be fair, but not necessarily equal. So, we're going to consider a lot of factors. For instance, the length of the marriage. Is someone at fault in the
Mhm.
breakup of the marriage? If there's adultery and one spouse is spending a lot of the community money on their extramarital affair, taking trips, buying property, cars, giving out cash to their paramour, that's going to be taken into account as well. Earning capacity, if one person is bringing down $500,000 a year in income and the other one is not, maybe they're an awesome school teacher, but
Mhm.
unfortunately, teachers in the state of Texas don't make a huge salary as they should.
Right.
And so maybe there's disparity in income. A court would take that into account. Maybe one spouse is disabled and cannot work. Or take it a step further, maybe a spouse cannot work because there's a child that has a disability, and it's less expensive for a parent to stay at home and not work than to hire a full time caregiver.
Mhm.
Or there's the spouse who's just not worked outside of the home during the marriage. A lot of parents or parties agree when they raise their children that we're going to have one parent at home all the time.
Mhm.
And so those are just a few of the factors that can play a role in how property is divided in the state of Texas.
Right. I think it's good. It's great that, they take those things into consideration because I feel like divorce in general is a very case by case, situation. Everybody's different.
Absolutely. They absolutely are. And every case is unique. And that's why it's important to really have an attorney who knows family law, who understands it, so that each case can be given the consideration that it needs.
So, since, it seems like it's incredibly important to have an accurate, like, everything, how can somebody ensure that their property is accurately valued and divided?
Well, for accurately valued and divided, I would say one thing that needs to happen is you want to make sure you have all the proper documentation in your case. You want to make sure it's part of your case and that you give it to your lawyer. And I have another podcast episode about gathering documents, but most of my clients really hate gathering documents. I hate gathering documents every year and I have to give them to my CPA, but we have to do it. And so it's really important to gather documents that show the value of the asset. First of all, that show the existence of an asset. Okay. If someone says, "Hey, I believe that there's a bank account out there at Bank of America." Well, how do you know? Show us proof. Well, here it is. Here's a document. I see these transactions. We're like, "Oh, that's good proof." So we want to have proof that the asset exists, one, as well as any liabilities, any debts. And then we need to know the value of those assets. So financial accounts are pretty easy. We just need statements. Other properties, such as businesses or real property, those may need to be evaluated or given a value by a certified appraiser. So, in order to have the best protection of one's assets, or really the best protection of one's property interests, because it's not just assets, it's also liabilities, make sure we have good numbers, good documentation. That's going to help a lot. That's going to help us in classifying the property as separate or community. And it's going to help us to come up with the numbers we need to get that fair and equitable division. And we also don't want to forget about hidden assets. And this comes up a lot. And that's why we use this thing called the discovery process to find out about assets and liabilities. Because sometimes people forget about bank accounts, financial accounts, retirement accounts. Oh yeah, I was at that job 10 years ago. I forgot I had retirement. Okay. So we want to make sure that assets are disclosed. And again, the discovery process helps with that. Sometimes people, though, hide assets on purpose. They'll put assets in the name of a friend or family member. They'll transfer them, especially if they're the party that filed for divorce. They may know that, hey, in a few months I'm going to file for divorce, so they start moving things around before the divorce. Or what I've seen people do is they'll buy property, they won't title it in their name, they'll put it in someone else's name, but they'll pay for it and they'll use it. So that too is considered a hidden asset. So, this is where working with an experienced attorney who knows the ins and outs of family law will help you to expose those hidden assets.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So, do you know, like, what are some professionals or resources that someone should consult to ensure that everything is fair with evaluations?
I would say definitely what you're saying, valuations. Have a certified and well experienced appraiser to appraise the business, to appraise real estate, to even appraise antiques and collections. And not just any one appraiser can do it all. Sometimes there may have to be more than one appraiser. There may be the real estate appraiser. There may be a CPA involved to do what we call tracking and tracing. That's going to be the subject of another episode, but sometimes we have to track dollars. How was that house purchased? Where did the money come from? To determine its character. Again, to determine if it's separate property or community property. So a CPA can be very useful. CPAs are also really useful in tracking market brokerage accounts, for instance, or even retirement accounts. And so, your CPAs, your real estate appraisers, your forensic appraisers, your business evaluators, your valuation experts, those are just a few of the experts that are going to be useful, especially for unique types of assets. Those are going to be very credible resources that your judge is going to rely on. Those are going to be people who are considered to be experts in the courtroom. And so if you've got assets, especially where the parties don't agree on the value, you definitely want to employ an expert so you can get the best value for your case. And so depending on which side you're on, you might want the highest value, or you may be looking for the lowest value. It just
Right.
depends on if you want to keep that property or not.
Right. So, what steps do you think listeners could take to start gathering the right documentation for something like this?
So the first steps, what we do, and I think a lot of family law attorneys do, is early in the case, if we know that there are going to be some property issues, we're going to have our clients complete a marital property questionnaire. Which I always warn my clients that it's homework. You're not going to really like it, but it's going to jog your memory.
Right.
And I think for most people, when they look at that questionnaire, which requires that they put down the name of any specific accounts, real property, like we cover almost any asset you can think of, as well as debts. And what we want our clients to do is to stop and think and pull any documents that are relevant to those assets or liabilities.
Mhm.
Basically, we say, look, to complete this marital property packet, you're going to have to pull documents. Whatever documents you pull, give those to us. Those documents are going to likely be key in your case. And so once a client does that, they've pretty much put their hand on the basic items that we need. And then once our team looks at those documents, and I look at them along with our paralegals, and we analyze them, we may decide we need even more documents. But a good place to start is that marital property questionnaire.
Mhm.
It gives a great guide, or rather, great guidance. And then from there, legal counsel will advise more of what's needed.
Right. Do you have like any examples of a case that would have been involving like a family business and how something like that was handled?
I mean, I can think of several cases, but of course, due to the attorney-client privilege, I can't, divulge specific facts, but I can kind of give some examples of, taking little pieces of different cases and sort of making up facts. For instance, let's take a case where there may be a hardware store,
Mhm.
and it's a small hardware store. It's not one of the national chains, but maybe it's one that is done well locally. People know it. It's been in an area for a couple of generations, and so may have a good reputation.
Mhm.
And so one spouse might say, oh, it's not worth much. We've had it for a little while. And if it's been around for a couple of generations, that means it's one of the spouse's separate property. And so things can get complicated there, especially if, for instance, the business originally, this is what comes up often. Someone has a business before they got married, but the business was not a separate entity. So, in the example I was giving of, let's say there's a hardware store, it was open for a couple of generations. Grandma, grandpa had it,
Mhm.
and but it was a sole proprietorship when grandma and grandpa had it. They weren't savvy, but they knew how to turn a dollar and they knew how to give good customer service. So this business continues to go on. But then during the marriage, the spouses want to take this business up another level. So maybe they're working with consultants and they realize, oh, we need to set it up as a separate entity. And when they do that, they're kind of starting a new business. So now the business is an LLC, or it's a S corp, or a corporation, and it's got a new tax ID, and it's just this new entity.
Mhm.
And so even though the business was in place before, owned by mom and pop or grandma and grandpa, now it's kind of a new entity. It's starting over again. It's got a new birth date and it's really got a new name.
Mhm.
And so that can be frustrating for the spouse who was running the business beforehand. But now with his new spouse in his or her marriage, because it can be man or woman, now they've set up this new entity. Now it's a new thing. They've given birth to a new entity. And now that entity is community property. Why? Because it was created during the marriage. And so that's something that's really tricky and you have to be careful of. I hear a lot of clients say, well, I had this business before I got married and when I was doing this and that with it, but during the marriage, we set it up as a separate entity.
Right.
And so it becomes like a new business. Another tricky area is with separate property real estate. For older spouses, a lot of times when they marry, they already have real property.
Mhm.
They already have a house. And so, but they, of course, when they get married, they don't need two houses. So usually they live in one of the spouse's houses, and then they lease the other house out. And then they take that lease money and they're paying their mortgage with it.
Mhm.
And it's a mortgage that they had before they got married, right?
Right.
Because they had these houses before they got married. So they were going to work and they were using their income to pay for their homes. But what happens is once a couple says, I do, and they marry, and unless they have a premarital agreement, their income becomes community income or marital income. And anything you spend on marital income is typically community property. But nonetheless, they take their paycheck and they use some of it to pay that house that they had before marriage. And that sounds normal and good, and it is. But what happens is they're now using marital income to pay a separate property debt. And that usually blows the mind of a lot of my clients. They're like, wait a minute, I had this house before I got married. I was at the same job before I got married that I am now. And I was using my paycheck to pay the mortgage. But now the mortgage is a separate property debt and I'm using my community income to pay separate property debt. Yes. And what that does is it triggers something called reimbursement claims that I won't get to in this podcast episode, but it becomes an issue in a divorce case if one spouse is using marital income to pay a debt that they had
Mhm.
before they got married. They can ask for the money to come back to
Right.
them when they're dividing up their marital estate. So again, it makes a difference to have an attorney that is knowledgeable of family law property so that these issues won't go missed in the divorce case.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, so having said all of that, with how complex everything seems to be, what would you think some of our listeners should know about dividing like retirement accounts or handling tax implications?
Correct. So those retirement accounts, and then there are tax implications when transferring property and so forth. But let's go to the retirement accounts. So the retirement accounts, most people think, oh, my retirement account, if I divide it, and I'm not of retirement age, I'm going to have to pay my early withdrawal penalties. I'm going to have to pay taxes. But that's not so. Our federal government has set up some wonderful laws, as well as our state legislature and our federal legislature. They set up laws to protect one in a divorce situation. So you can divide one's retirement, especially you have to if it's retirement that accrued during the marriage. Well, I take that back. It doesn't have to be divided, but it really is going to be considered when you're dividing a marital estate. And so once we figure out, hey, that pension needs to be divided, some of it needs to go to one spouse and some needs to go to the other spouse, we're going to use something called a qualified domestic relations order to divide that retirement, whether it's a pension or 401k. The qualified domestic relations order will prevent that retirement from being penalized and taxed when it's being divided in a divorce.
Right.
And so make sure you do that. Sometimes I've had clients hire me and they've attempted to work out as much as they can in their divorce case. They try to divide all of their property in advance. I've encountered some people who have actually taken money out of their retirement before the divorce case was filed in an attempt to divide everything and save money, and they really hurt themselves.
Mhm.
You don't want to do that. Don't take a disbursement from your retirement account in order to divide your marital estate. Do it using a qualified domestic relations order, or we call it a quadro for short. And that's going to keep you from being penalized and taxed.
Right. Are there any specific strategies to kind of avoid excessive tax burdens during property division?
I will say this. I always advise my clients to definitely consult with their tax experts,
Mhm.
especially if they have liabilities or they've been digging in their retirement, during the divorce. They're going to have some tax penalties. and they're going to have maybe a higher tax liability. So it's always a great idea to include a financial advisor
Mhm.
or a CPA, because a lot of family law attorneys are not tax experts. There are some that
Right.
are. There are some family law attorneys that are actually CPAs. My hat's off to them. But the majority of family law attorneys are not experts. And so I always advise my client, if I feel like there is a really heavy tax issue in the case, I'm going to invite in a CPA, and then we'll have a CPA as an expert
Mhm.
to help us to divide the estate.
I mean, that makes sense to me, and I think that's all I have for you.
That sounds great. So hopefully this information has been helpful. Dividing property in Texas during a divorce, it can be complex, but you don't have to navigate it alone. And I definitely encourage you to not navigate it alone. Understanding the basics of property is the first step, but having great legal representation like we offer at the Alsandor Law Firm is a second step. So if you have any questions or you need guidance, don't hesitate to reach out to our firm. We want you to have and we want to help you protect what's yours. So thank you for tuning in today. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast for more family law topics. If you found this information to be helpful, leave a review and share the information with other people who may be interested. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Alsandor Law Podcast. If you need expert legal representation for matters about family law, the Houston Family Law Team at the Alsandor Law Firm is here to help. Visit alsandorlaw.com to learn more. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review our show and share it with others who might benefit from the conversations. Join us next week as we continue to explore crucial family law topics. Stay resilient and know that we're committed to supporting you every step of your journey.